So it's been a couple months since I've gotten the M1 Mac Mini, and I think it's finally time I give you a good review from my perspective as a developer and somewhat of a content creator. So let's jump right into it. Historically, the M1 Mac Mini has always been the best bang for your buck to get into the Apple ecosystem. And it all makes sense, being the only option from the Mac lineup that allows you to cut corners a bit by using your own screen and peripherals, which obviously drives up the price of their other products a lot. On top of that, the version bringing in the new M1 chips drove the prices down even further compared to last generation Intel-based Mac Minis. All of this making it by far the best option if you want the best performance while keeping your budget as small as possible. For example, my 16GB of RAM, 500GB storage model is barely more expensive than the last base version Intel-based Mac Mini. But does the M1 Mac Mini actually live up to the hype when you actually use it on a daily basis? That's what I'll be trying to answer today. I won't be diving much into numbers or whatever benchmarking tool I could be using because it has all been done by reviewers when the Mini and other M1 Macs first came out. Before they inevitably packed it back up and sent it back to Apple when their reviews were done. What seems a lot more interesting is to actually give you the perspective of someone who has used the computer for hours every day for the past couple of months. The big thing that came out of all these reviews was that, at least on paper, the M1 Macs and especially the Mini were extremely fast machines, and to me that feeling held mostly true. I spend most of my time on Xcode or Final Cut Pro, and these two apps being first-party programs developed by Apple, you can clearly tell that they were heavily optimized to make the most out of the new M1 chips. Compile times are extremely fast on Xcode. The whole program feels very snappy, even when doing things that were a bit rough on my old MacBook, like refreshing SwiftUI previews. There's no real hanging when searching through bigger codebases or even refactoring. It's kind of hard to review how editors feel and how performant they are, but to me, an editor feels good when it's not frustrating me because it has trouble opening files, it's slow to search, or whatever other reason. If I can forget about the editor itself and just use it as a tool that gets out of the way as much as possible, I'm happy with it. And the M1 Mini brings exactly that to Xcode. It's been the same story for Final Cut Pro, much faster rendering and exporting times than what I was ever used to, and the application just feels very snappy and responsive while you're actually working on it. My old computer used to take a sweet time re-rendering my timeline whenever I would move around too much or make cuts into big projects, making it an absolute pain to edit at times. Absolutely none of that has happened on the M1 Mac. One of the best parts of this whole performance side of things is that, on top of what I just said, the M1 Mac Mini runs basically completely silent, and through a couple months of daily use has barely ever gotten slightly warm to the touch. The spec says there's a fan in the M1 Mini, but I'm still not convinced about that at all. That's just how quiet this thing is. So that's all fine and good for Apple's own apps that were obviously optimized, but what about other programs? Here's where it gets slightly more nuanced. I think for the most part, you can expect the same kind of performances from bigger companies that will make the jump to support native M1 apps. But if the tools you use on a daily basis haven't updated to native support yet, you won't really have the same type of fast response and performances you see in other apps. I'll use Figma as an example because it's another app I use a lot on a daily basis. At the time of making this video, it was still going through Rosetta, Apple's software that acts as a bridge to run old apps that weren't updated for the new M1 chip. Figma feels good on the new M1 Mac Mini. It's fast enough and totally usable without it getting annoying at all, but it didn't have that amazing jump in performance and definitive difference coming from my old MacBook. It feels slightly faster as a general rule, but it's not night and day like it is when comparing Xcode or Final Cut between my two machines. The M1 Mac Mini is probably going to stay a great option for people wanting to get into the Apple ecosystem for cheap for a little while. So whenever you look into it for yourself, just look at an updated list of your most used apps and programs and see if it runs through Rosetta 2 or if it runs natively, so you can get an idea of if you're going to be making the most of your new computer. DoesItArm.com is a great database of just about every program you can think of that lists exactly that information. It also lists apps that are completely unsupported on M1 Macs, apps that won't run at all if you try. Through normal use of the computer, I haven't run into a single issue with an unsupported app, but again, it might be worth checking if you use something on a daily basis that is slightly less mainstream. Things like games are obviously a bit of a tough call, for example, as many of them were barely supported on Intel Macs, and that change means they definitely aren't supported anymore on the new architecture. If they are supported, though, through my limited testing, I found that games that had native builds run extremely smoothly, World of Warcraft being the one big game that has actually done it. And even other games like Rocket League run perfectly fine through Rosetta and with good enough performances. So as long as you're not expecting gaming PC performances and that your games are actually supported through Rosetta or possibly native builds in the future, you can definitely get away with some light gaming on this machine. Okay, so everything looks pretty good so far. Slightly worse performance through Rosetta, but nothing too bad, and incredible performances on native apps, and all that at a fairly reasonable price for a Mac computer, all things considered. So does this computer have any downsides? To me, it has two pretty obvious ones. Number one, and it's a recurring issue with Apple products over the past couple years, the I/O is average at best, with 2 USB-A ports, 2 USB-C ports, and HDMI and an Ethernet port. It's definitely on the low side of things when it comes to usability. No SD card reader, only one HDMI port means there's definitely a lot of people that buy this computer that will end up having to buy some type of hub or dongles to make it work with their setup and what they use on a daily basis. And number two, which is made much more obvious by the fact that the I/O is underwhelming, and probably the biggest complaint I have about this computer. The M1 Mini, like many of its predecessors, has some terrible Bluetooth issues. It's not too bad when using a keyboard, and I haven't had complete disconnection issues with my peripherals, like my AirPods, for example. But a Bluetooth mouse is almost entirely out of the question for me. It's usable, but so far off of being a smooth experience that there's absolutely no chance I will ever use a Bluetooth mouse with this computer unless they come up with a software fix. That means my mouse already uses one of my 2 USB-A ports, which is, in my opinion, completely unacceptable for a device like that coming from Apple, which exclusively sells Bluetooth peripherals. But it's definitely something that you should consider before getting one if you don't like the alternative of using Bluetooth peripherals. So anyways, I think I've rambled on long enough. I hope this was helpful to some of you out there. If it was, consider hitting the like button or the subscribe button if you want to see more content like this one. I'll see you all in the next video. And until then, take care.